The ladder match. How often have these heights captivated many a wrestling fan? And for good reason, but there is more to it than a simple what goes up must come down, and on top of that, there is an interesting way on how to work the whole system, one that I feel should be the topic of this episode. Because today, a big thank you to my supporters over on Patreon, such as Dakari Garmin, Mr. J, Ron Hawthorne, Mangy Stray, Harry Flynn, and The Reflection of Perfection. Thank you so much for all the help, it really does mean a lot. Okay, so recently, I was asked by a certain subscriber's son, what is the perfect amount of wrestlers for a ladder match, and what would be too many? Well, that got me thinking, and after I really started pondering it, I realized that there was a very good logistical answer to that, and it's one that I think many fans just don't think about. So, thank you to Dorigi and Dorigi Jr. for bringing this to my attention. But before we get into the bulk of the matter, let's start talking about how the ladder match came to be. Like with many things in professional wrestling, the true origins of the ladder match aren't really known, as there are several parties that all lay claim to inventing this fantastic bout. For starters, British wrestler Kendo Nagasaki competed in a Disco Challenge ladder match against Clive Myers on the World of Sport wrestling show, with the goal being both men trying to grab a golden disco record that was suspended above the ring. However, predating that by 8 years in 1972, Stampede Wrestling held a ladder match between Dan Crawfat and Tor Kamada, with the two of them vying to grab actual money in the bank as a wad of cash was suspended above the ring. Although this match wouldn't air until 1987, which would be after the Nagasaki match. However, even before that, in July of 1983, and Stampede yet again would have a ladder match between Bret Hart and Bad News Allen. Both men would go on to join the World Wrestling Federation the following year, and from there, Bret would actually suggest the match to Vince McMahon, who was a bit skeptical, but Bret knew that he was onto something. And so, while a lot of people erroneously believe that Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon had the first ever ladder match in the World Wrestling Federation at WrestleMania 10, the truth is Shawn Michaels did have the first ladder match, but with Bret Hart, just about 2 years prior to the WrestleMania match against Razor. Now, this first ladder match for the World Wrestling Federation would also be for the Intercontinental Championship and would be filmed primarily for use for the Coliseum home video, but then it would gain a lot more exposure with the advent of DVD. And as a result of this bout, the ladder match would become a hit, with the WWF expanding its role even further, and Vince himself got in on the act, as him and Shane competed in a 2-on-1 handicap ladder match against Stone Cold Steve Austin, with the winner getting 100% ownership of the WWF, in kayfabe, of course. Tag teams would soon be then introduced to WWF ladder matches, with Matt and Jeff Hardy going against Edge and Christian, with the winners receiving the management services of one Terry Reynolds. Oh, and 100 kayfabe grand. And of course, this would then lead to the creation of the TLC match, which had a proto bout at WrestleMania 2000, featuring the Hardys, Edge and Christian, and the Dudley Boys. However, it wasn't first referred to as a TLC match, instead it was called a Triangle Ladder match, but same thing. And then in 2005, we would see the creation of the Money in the Bank ladder match, created by Chris Jericho. Even though he's never gotten to win one himself, which is definitely not going to happen while he's in another company. But speaking of which, there have been many other promotions to do ladder matches, it's not just WWE, and I think they deserve some exploring too. The NWA's first ever ladder match featured Dusty Rhodes going against Tully Blanchard in a barbed wire ladder match for 100 kayfabe grand, which took place at the Great American Bash 1987. It would be a full decade before WCW would try this again, with Eddie Guerrero taking on Syxx for the WCW United States Championship, a match that took place on January 25th, 1997. This was then followed up by Bill Goldberg getting to have his revenge against Scott Hall, with a taser being held above the ring. This was the result of Scott Hall using a taser on Bill Goldberg at Starrcade 1998, resulting in Goldberg's famous winning streak finally coming to a close. Several other WCW ladder matches would occur, but it would take until July of 2000 before World Championship Wrestling finally got into the tag team ladder match game, with the Young Dragons defeating 3 Count and a series of tag team ladder matches happening afterwards. And personally speaking, these ladder matches that featured mostly cruiserweights was the best and only good part of WCW in the year 2000, if you ask me. And this should go without saying, but TNA also got involved in the ladder game as well, with their first ladder match featuring Sabu going against Malice. And while TNA's famous Ultimate X match did emphasize no limits and no ladders, the X Division title itself was held up for grabs in many a ladder match, with Jerry Lynn, Low-Ki, and AJ Styles being the first to compete for the belt with the ladder coming into play. But perhaps TNA's most famous variation would be the King of the Mountain match, which would serve as something of a reverse of the norm, where the winner would be the first person to attach something to the top, rather than take it down. Oh, and TNA would also have the Full Metal Mayhem match, which was pretty much just a TLC. And additionally, how could we ever forget about Extreme Championship Wrestling? That would change things up by having a weapon held above the ring, but instead of retrieving it and therefore winning, you were simply just allowed to use it, and you still had to score a pinfall in order to get the W, with the first time they did this seeing the Sandman defeat Sabu at the House Party pay-per-view in 1998, making it 2 ladder firsts for Sabu. Okay, so now that we've taken that quick trip down memory lane, it's time to answer the question.
You forgot Kenny Omega versus Michael Elgin.
I didn't say I was going to name every single ladder match ever, I was just giving some quick context. Anyway.
Also the Hardys versus the Young Bucks in Ring of Honor.
I hate the both of you. I really do. I really do. Anyway, let's get into the question. How many people is too many people for a ladder match? And what's the reason behind this? Now we know that a ladder match can work with 2 wrestlers, but I think it's also safe to say that 100 would be a bit too many. And therefore, the answer has to be somewhere in between, but how many precisely? Well, we do know that the Royal Rumble has 30 participants. However, all 30 of them are not in the ring at the same time. But that's not to say we don't have Battle Royals with 20. But we do have to take into consideration that we have to make room for the ladder itself, and we also need to clear the runway so some people can run around and do some spots, as Battle Royals and Royal Rumbles tend to be just a lot of punching when the ring is too packed. And even if we cut this number in half to 10 participants, this does feel like a full house, so to speak, even though WWE has done this. And just to be clear, for this examination, we're not counting 2020's Money in the Bank, which saw 2 simultaneous Money in the Bank ladder matches, giving us a grand total of 12 participants running around through Titan Tower. Gas leak year doesn't count. Okay, so now back to the lecture at hand. Because with 10 wrestlers, there's still plenty of real estate to run around, and that also doesn't consider that some wrestlers will be outside the ring too. So if it's not about the amount of ring space that's covered, then what is it? Well, it actually has to do with logistics. Let's take a look at some Money in the Bank history, as the first 2 Money in the Banks had 6 participants, only for 2007 and WrestleMania 23 to up the ante to 8 in total. This number would fluctuate until WrestleMania 26, which did indeed feature 10 wrestlers in the match. But as it would appear, apparently WWE also thought this was a bridge too far, as this was the most amount of wrestlers ever in a Money in the Bank ladder match. And the following year, they would bust that number right back down again. And they, as of this recording, have yet to ever go back to having a full 10 on deck. But now, why is that? Clearly, WWE is capable of doing it, but they rather opt not to. Well, as I said earlier, I think it's all about logistics, because there's one major fundamental part of this program that we, the audience, keeps on forgetting, and that's the camera. Since it tends to go so well and most of the time without a hitch, we tend to forget how often WWE is a television product, even though we are watching it on TV. And the Money in the Bank is of course no exception. But putting together a bout like this requires a lot more effort and a lot more work than I think a lot of fans realize, especially when it comes to coordinating it as a television program. Think about it this way. For a Royal Rumble, even if there were all 30 participants in the ring at the same time, being inside the square circle means that there's one focal point, one place to center on, allowing for camera personnel to film outside of the ring and just focus on who they need to focus on, as well as having a hard cam to catch all the action from afar. But the problem with ladder matches and a lot of multi-man matches is that the chaos can brew anywhere and everywhere all at once. And so you need at least 2 camera people to follow around the pairs of wrestlers that split off. You need one camera filming the current spot, but you also need another one that's already queued up and ready to go, that way you can cut straight to it. Because 2 guys will be fighting here, and another 2 guys will be fighting there, and another 2 guys will be fighting over there, and so on. And this natural pairing process is why I tend to prefer even number participants in matches. But anyway, as it's inevitable that these pairs will split off and move all around the arena, you need a camera person to follow them around. But if you have too many wrestlers, this can be a lot of legwork for just 2 camera people. And this doesn't take into account that some things might have to change on the fly. So for more wrestlers, you might have to add more cameras. But either way, this can get really confusing and really hectic. And so even if we do have all the room to spare in order to have 10 full participants, we also need to make room for the cameramen to follow them as well. And they need their own set of space, they need their own set of rules. And unlike non-televised wrestling, this needs to be a little more controlled, as WWE being on point where their television production tends to know where the action is, where the primary spots are happening, ensuring that the board operator is showing whatever the biggest action that the audience needs to see is right at that moment. It'd be awful if something big happens only for the audience at home to be looking at something else. And as such, when it comes to laying out a match, while I can't say for certain because I don't work for WWE, I am fairly confident that they do plot things out in advance, at least to the degree that they know that only one major spot should be happening at a time, which is all part of why the collaboration and the choreography are so important to have locked down airtight. And therefore, considering that camera personnel have their own layout, as well as knowing that only one major beat is going to be happening at any given moment, to make the lives of the production crew, 8 seems like the best number to work with, even though WWE can afford all the cameras in the world. This way, you know that every possible pairing is going to be able to have a cameraman dedicated to them, as well as a hard camera sitting in the back, as well as the Wile E. Coyote cam from up top, or anything else that they might want to film. And when you think about all of it that way, it is not all that shocking that 8 tends to be the usual norm, as this maximizes the amount of participants, but still allows you to control the chaos. Well, there you go, a little bit of history behind a ladder match, as well as a little bit of insight onto how television production works. Let me know how you feel about the ladder match down in the comments, and please make sure that you're subscribed to Dave Knows Wrestling, because this is the Thinking Fans channel, and it deserves that silver play button. Wouldn't you agree? Anyway, thank you to you for watching, and thank you to all my wonderful Patreon supporters out there. Thanks again for watching, and as always, Dave Knows.